Hey, brothers and sisters in faith, I want to welcome you back to another segment of Jesus Action Ministries, taking action the way that Christ would. All right, so today's discussion is a very important one. I have been requested by a few brothers and sisters in the faith to do a segment on how to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ to Muslims. For 28 years, I was a practicing Muslim. And I learned a lot about Islamic theology. I understand how the Muslim mind works. I understand the psychology that drives Muslims. And I think that in order to communicate with anyone, you have to know a little bit of something about that person. It shows that you are serious in communicating with that person, but it also shows that you have respect for that person's identity. So it's very important that Christians understand a little bit about Muslim psychology if they're going to communicate effectively the gospel of Jesus Christ. Islam is a multifaceted, very complicated theology. It is multi-layered. It is not simply a belief system about who and what God is. It also includes and is inclusive of many rituals, many obligations that are binding upon the practicing Muslim, like 5 daily prayers, fasting during the month of Ramadan, a charity tax, if you will, for the practicing members of the faith, for those who are without resources, a mandatory trip to Mecca once in your lifetime if you have the resources. And then there is a plethora of theological components that deal with the nature of God, that deal with the reality of the next world, such as what heaven will be like and what hell will be like, and how will God respond to the deeds and the character of the believer. So there are many facets of the faith, and those facets usually come down to what we call the Holy Quran and the Sunnah, which are the statements, the oral traditions of Muhammad. So when you go into the Muslim world, or you enter into the realm of a conversation with a Muslim, there are things that you should know about that person's faith so that you can understand exactly how that person thinks with regards to God. One of the misconceptions that I've heard when talking to Christians about Muslims is that somehow, because they have the wrong belief, they're not sincere in their commitment to God. Nothing can be further from the truth. Muslims are very committed to their belief in God. They're very committed to reverence and respect for things that are sacred. What Christians can do is that they can take that reverential respect that Muslims have for God and put it in the appropriate context. That takes time, that takes knowledge, and that takes being able to prioritize what is important about the gospel. What is it that we want to communicate with Muslims? One of the mistakes that people commonly make, that Christian missionaries and outreach pastors and chaplains make when talking to Muslims, is they try to engage Muslims automatically in some theological argument. They want to talk about the nature of Christ rather than the work of Christ. Talking about the nature of God is good for philosophy. Talking about the nature of God is also good for intellectual stimulation. But at the end of the day, most conflicts in theology are related to semantics. They're related to words. You have your words for God, I have my words for God, and somewhere in the process we can become confused because our meanings and our definitions may not be congruent. Those things are subjective. But what is an objective truth, what is a historical fact, is the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. What is a historical truth and an objective fact is the cosmic change that brought about. What is a historical truth and an objective fact is that through Christ, mankind now has reconciliation with God. The work of Jesus Christ And the significance of that work and the cosmic scheme of history and of mankind's existence on earth is where the priority needs to be. Of course, there are ways to explain or to get Muslims to see that there is credibility, more credibility to your argument than their own. And we'll talk about some of those things. But the most important thing I want to focus on at this point is what should be the priority. Should we be talking about the work of Christ or the nature of Christ? Should we be talking about should we be seeking to engage Muslims in theological discourse at the expense of confusing them and them neglecting the salvational work of Calvary? Or should we focus on the salvational work of Calvary and keep our presentation of Jesus simple enough that even a child would be able to understand it? That even the man who was on the cross next to Christ, who had no complex theological understanding, but understood that Christ was the Messiah and that was sufficient. Should we opt for simplicity over complexity, or complexity at the expense of confusing someone about our faith? Prioritize the work of Christ over everything. Now, how do we communicate that work? Well, one of the things that is important to Muslims is the Quran. Muslims believe that the Quran is the verbatim speech of God. And in believing that, they believe that the book is free from discrepancy, from contradictions and inconsistencies. The Quran itself gives its own acid test. It makes several claims about its own text as evidence that it is from God and it is not a product of human involvement. One of these tests says the Quran should be free from contradiction. The Quran says that it's free from contradiction. Another one says that the Quran would be preserved as is. There would be God would preserve it, and there would be no change that would come to the text as a result of God having preserved it. Unlike what it says about the Christian scriptures that has been corrupted because the priests and the rabbis have changed the text. So according to the Quran, the text will not be changed because God himself is watching over it. And a final and very important criteria is that the Quran gives is that no one can produce a chapter like the Quran itself. So we have a three-pronged criteria. The first is there's no discrepancy. The second is it would be preserved as is. And the third is that no human being can produce something like it. If this criteria that the Quran gives for itself as the validity for its authenticity, if this criteria is proven to be false, then the Muslim has to concede that your position is more valid than his or her own. We can't start here until we start here. I can't talk about Muhammad and incite a negative response by speaking about his character flaws and attacking his person, and then expect someone to listen to me about a loving God exemplified and personified in the person of Christ. This is the contradiction. No, we start with the evidence that the Quran itself provides for its authenticity. And if we provide evidence showing that the Quran violates its own criteria, then we have a position to present Christ. And when that presentation is made, we start with what's important, the work of Christ. We don't get into theological and philosophical discussions about the nature of Christ. It was those same discussions that drove Christians into divided parties. It was those same discussions that led to strife in the Christian church in the early centuries of its formation. I honestly believe that the work of Christ takes precedent over any other discussion related to his nature, to his power, his relationship to God, and his special place, his special cosmic place in heaven prior to his descent on earth. Those are all great items of discussion, but they should not be a first item in communicating the gospel to our Muslim brothers and sisters. We're going to continue on this discussion, and I'll provide and offer some more insight that I think would be relevant to a successful effort to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ to members of the Muslim faith. Thank you for tuning in.